I'd really like to welcome you tonight. My name is Catherine Murray. I'm with the School of Communication at Simon Fraser University, and I'm also co-director of the Spry Foundation Memorial Lecture Series. It's a unique institution. I'd like to take a few minutes today to just explain a little bit about how this operates and introduce our very wonderful speaker for this evening. For tonight, the format is going to be roughly as follows. We'll begin with a few introductory remarks. Then Professor Graham Murdock will speak for approximately 50 minutes on, as you can see, building the digital commons, which is an enterprise facing us all. And we will then welcome questions and answers at the end of that period. I'd like to tell you that tonight will be taped, and it will be available on the School of Communications website probably within a week. So it'll be available for reference and so on. And there will also be a text version of the talk, and it's possible to compare tonight's talk with some of the others that we've had in the past. Also on the website, at this time at the University of Montreal. So, without too much more ado on the logistics, I'd like to point out that tonight is the 9th annual lecture for the Graham Spry Fund for Public Broadcasting. And remind us, although you're probably well aware of it, that Graham Spry was one of the co-founders of the Canadian Radio League in the 1930s, which was really a citizens' coalition, very broadly based, involving members of the Canadian clubs, women's clubs, agricultural groups, educators, from a very wide cross-section of Canadian society. And this citizens' coalition succeeded in the day of persuading largely conservative legislators under Prime Minister Robert Borden of the time to create what has since become the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. Graham Spry really worked all his life lobbying for what he saw as the citizens' need for an independent public sphere of communication. And he was constantly a technological opportunist, keen for social groups and citizens to seize the benefits of a new technology while preserving its community character and closing gaps in cultural literacies and life chances. Remember that Graham Spry was one of Canada's first social Fabians, although he found it prudent politically later to distance himself from that label. But he was active in the League of Social Reconstruction, agitated for universal health care policy in this country, and unceasing in his conviction, really, that all Canadian peoples, regardless of education, class, or social background, should be able to enjoy the benefits of public broadcasting. I think in his era, the idea of public-private partnerships, such a convenient catchword in today's provincial scene and federally as well, the idea of public-private partnerships to develop a new technological frontier like the internet was really an anathema. And Graham Spry was one of the most forceful of public lobbyists to argue that any unthinking adoption of a new technology in Canada would really lead all citizens to have to rethink the choice between the state and the United States, something that was a very radical rallying cry at the time. And in view of the unfortunate demise of Carolyn Parrish, perhaps something that she might remember to refer to more elegantly in the future. In any case, it's also likely that in Graham's era, the rapid diffusion of the internet, as well as its rapid commercialization, would simply not have been as well understood at the time without a central role for citizens and public broadcasting through the state. But today we find this internet celebrated as a kind of cornucopia of commercial choice, and as Graham will talk about, very many are sounding the death knell for both the public regulator in Canada, the CRTC, the Canadian Radio, Television and Telecommunications Commissioner, and of course the public broadcasters, BBC, CBC, and so on around the world. I think Graham Spry would be disturbed about the absence of a broad-based social movement challenging these developments, and he would be very disturbed by the absolute silence about these issues among the major federal parties in the last federal election. So, to foster public debate, his family set up the Endowment for the Spry Foundation in partnership with Simon Fraser University School of Communication and the University of Montreal, led by Professor Marc Ravoy there, which created the Memorial Lecture Series. And I want to refer you once again to the website for past archives of talks, which are very useful in our current times. I particularly would like to thank the Office of the President of Simon Fraser University, Mr. Michael Stevenson, the Dean of the Faculty of Applied Sciences, Mr. Brian Lewis, the School of Communication, Professor Martin Lava, who's here this evening, and particularly Denise Zenner and Sue Jameson McLaren. I know Sue is here and has been working to make this event publicly known and widely known throughout the community for tonight. We are very proud to bring you tonight Professor Graham Murdock of the University of Loughborough. I'm close, Loughborough. He says it so much more melodiously, in the United Kingdom, to speak about the challenges of building a digital commons. No one is probably better suited to talk on the issue. Professor Murdock has gained almost legendary status among those studying the political economy of communication in Canada and those interested in social consequences. And what is also interesting about the work he does is that he constantly seeks stronger links between citizens, policymakers, and academics in studying complex communication phenomena. Professor Murdock is a reader in the sociology of culture at Loughborough University. I'm close. And before moving there, he worked at Leicester, where he was a leading member of the Pioneering Center for Mass Communication Research. He has been a visiting professor at the University of California at San Diego, the Free University of Brussels, Bergen University, and Stockholm University. He's written widely on the social and cultural organization of mass media, but is best known for his work on the political economy of communication and the future of broadcasting. He is a former head of the political economy section of the International Association of Communication Research, and his work has been translated into 14 languages. Indeed, he is now studying Mandarin for a wider distribution throughout China. He is currently researching the social impact of new communication technologies and the relations between broadcasting and the internet. And it is about the latter that he will be talking tonight. Please welcome Professor Murdock. Thank you.
Well, let me first of all say that it's an enormous pleasure to be in Vancouver, and it's a very great honor to be asked to give this lecture in memory of one of the great figures in the fight for a public sphere in communications. And it's also, I have to say, an enormous relief to be in what we are now urged to call the United States of Canada, which includes your fine country and the thin, pitifully thin strips down both coasts of the United States that voted for Kerry. I, as you will probably notice, you won't now because the slides changed, but a lot of people think I must be related to Rupert Murdoch. He does know who I am. In fact, he was rumoured once to say that he would never allow me in any of the buildings that he owns. But the last time I gave such an address as this, the venue was the Royal Society of Engineers building in London, a very splendid building. And around the ceiling they have little statues of the great engineers, one of whom I'm very proud to say was one of my ancestors. It's the man who invented domestic gas lighting. And I was on a very powerful platform with two cabinet ministers. And I was trying to think of a way to introduce what I was going to say because I knew they wouldn't want to hear it. And so I said, well, you probably think I'm related to Rupert Murdoch, but I'm not. I said, but I see you do have a statue of my ancestor. I think I can honestly say that my family have brought more enlightenment to the public than Rupert's. You may revise your opinion after you've heard what I've got to say. I'd like to begin with three quotations which I've put up on the overhead. The first comes from Joan Bakewell, who entered the BBC in 1954 as a trainee and has recently retired. She was one of the great figures of the BBC's great era of television all through the 60s and the 70s. And you'll see that that's a statement of regret. Her recent autobiography is a long regret for the passing of something that she was proud of. You'll see also a statement there by Robert James Walker. Again, many broadcasters of that generation would share that sentiment, that they were involved in something great, but it's gone. But the last quotation comes from one of Britain's best political theorists, David Marquand. It is time to retrieve, or perhaps to reinvent, the public domain. And that's really the theme of what I'm going to say. I think it's particularly important to say it now, and it's particularly important for a political economist to say it, since we've inherited the mantle of economics as being the dismal science. And I have to say I've made my money being one of the most pessimistic commentators you could possibly imagine. In fact, if I would come to a meeting and find somebody more pessimistic than myself, I would try and outdo them by thinking of something even more miserablest to say about the way the world was going. And let's not underestimate what it is that's happening. Certainly in Britain and in many other countries I'm familiar with, the last 2 decades have been a disaster for public television. You've had a great sweeping chorus of people singing the last rites of an institution which they now consider to be well past its sell-by date, and arguing more and more vociferously for a wholly commercialized system. They argue that the license fee is an unacceptable curb on consumer freedom. In fact, they argue that almost any taxation is an unacceptable curb on consumer freedom. And they argue very vociferously for the right to be allowed to make as much money as possible with as little responsibility as possible. And they've made considerable inroads. And that accounts for the pessimism of broadcasters of Joan's generation. But I actually want to argue the opposite case tonight. I want to argue that this pessimism is misplaced, and that we now stand at a historic point of opportunity, and that far from being something that is on the way out, or can be put in a box, a little bit of decoration in a commercialized environment, I want to argue that public service broadcasting is a project whose time has only just now finally come. And I want to argue with David Marquand that we do need to reinvent the public domain. And we need this more than ever because of the massive increase in individualism and commercialism that now dominates and defines our cultural landscape. But I want to argue that this reinvention has to take a new perspective. Most of the thinking on broadcasting up until now has been dominated by what I call an analog map of the world. Because analog technologies were largely incompatible with one another, what we're familiar with is a cultural landscape that is divided into very recognizable domains, cultural industries. So you still go to the record store to buy a record, you still go to the bookstore to buy a book, you still go to the cinema to watch movies, you still go to a discotheque to dance. We're used to these separations. And broadcasting has seen itself always as another pillar in this great collection of skyscrapers. But a digital map would require us to knock that whole downtown area to the ground and start again. And I want to argue that the opportunity that broadcasting faces, and that public broadcasting faces particularly, is that for the first time we have the chance to make a practical working coalition between broadcasting, public institutions, and a whole series of civil initiatives. And that the key to that is using the internet in a creative way. But before I get on to that, it's very important to sketch in some of the background, because one of the great impediments to this is the baggage that we all carry with us from the past. Those of you who believe that the past is finished, I recommend you, if you haven't already, to read the front page of today's Globe and Mail. It features a magnificent story about Prince Charles, our heir to the throne. And I have to say, as someone who has Scottish ancestry, I've been a Republican since I broke my coronation mark at the age of 5. This is Charles. What is wrong with people nowadays? Why do they all seem to think they're qualified? So I want to distinguish five core cultural rights that citizenship requires. Rights of information, rights of knowledge, rights of deliberation, rights of representation, and rights of participation. Information rights. Firstly, citizens are entitled to comprehensive and disinterested information about current events and conditions, and particularly about the actions, motivations, and plans of all those institutions, both governmental and corporate, with significant power over their life chances and their living conditions. But information itself doesn't confer empowerment. You could watch the news 24 hours a day for the rest of your life and still not understand why the world is like it is. That's why I work in a university and not in a news organisation. Universities are not information institutions, they're knowledge institutions. Information is useless unless you also have rights to knowledge. Knowledge consists of those interpretive frameworks that convert information into explanations, that identify causes, that highlight unnoticed links and connections, that clarify how particular decisions will impact on people's lives. So knowledge rights are about putting things in patterns, making connections, suggesting explanations, making sense of what is going on. But because in modern societies there is never only one explanation or one pattern, that all of those are fiercely contested, the third set of rights are absolutely crucial, deliberative rights. That is, citizens have to have access to forums in which the merits of competing accounts can be debated in a serious-minded way. Now, deliberation, the concept of deliberation, has been central to contemporary theories of democracy. And one of the most influential figures in putting that case has been the German philosopher Jürgen Habermas. He distinguishes something he calls the political public sphere, which he identifies with all of those places where issues connected with the practice of the state, as he puts it, are discussed. So public broadcasting would be part of the political public sphere for Habermas. But there's a problem with the way he puts this argument. In his original book, The Structure and Transformation of the Public Sphere, which he published at the beginning of the 1960s, before social movements really began to gather momentum, he identifies another public sphere, which he calls the literary public sphere, because he's writing primarily about the 19th century, which he sees as centred on popular fiction. And he says the point of that sphere, that's where people go to find out about themselves and to find out about other people. That's where they go to take imaginative journeys into what it might be like to be somebody else. But he doesn't think of that as being part of the political public sphere. Political public sphere is about the serious business of public issues and governmental decision-making. This is a very dangerous separation, and it's been very dangerous for public broadcasting. You can see why it's dangerous if you begin to read some of the policy documents produced by neoliberal economists. One of the best examples of this is a British government document that was commissioned by Mrs. Thatcher, produced by a panel chaired by one of our most famous neoliberal economists, Professor Alan Peacock. That concluded that all of the BBC services in future should be sold on subscription, should be fully commercialised. If people wanted to watch that stuff, fine, let them pay £5 or 10 quid or whatever, no problem. They had the sovereign right not to watch the BBC if they didn't like it. But then they recognise, as they put it, that there are some types of programmes, and I'm quoting, which are unlikely to be commercially self-supporting in the view of broadcasting entrepreneurs, but which are necessary to citizenship and therefore might require some public subsidy. The list is very interesting. It's headed by news, current affairs and documentaries, and it includes critical and controversial programmes covering everything from the appraisal of commercial products to politics, ideology, philosophy and religion. So they conclude that public broadcasting, that's what it should do. It should be part of Habermas's political public sphere. And they conclude, of course, that commercial broadcasters should be released from having to do these very expensive things. They can get on with game shows, soap operas and all the rest of it. There's a real difficulty with that. A very simple logical difficulty. A very wonderful book by American political theorist called Noel McPhee was just published. She says, if that was true, why would you bother to enter deliberation at all? If you already know what you want, and Habermas assumes that you do, why would you get involved with deliberation? You get involved with debate. Debate involves pushing a position, defending it, and trying to beat the other side down. Deliberation is something quite different. Deliberation is primarily about listening, not about speaking. It's about being willing to let go of your position, willing to go over to the other side, to understand where people are coming from, and to come to a genuine consensus or a genuine provisional settlement across those borders. It's not about defeating people, it's about cooperating with them. So where do the imaginative resources to do that come from? I would argue they come precisely from fiction, from comedy, from entertainment. Because it's in those parts of broadcasting that we make those imaginative walks. And if we cease to do that, if public broadcasting ceases to encourage people to do that, then it does not provide fully for deliberative rights. It has to provide not only forums for discussion, but it has to provide the resources that allow people to enter those discussions with respect for other people's positions. Now that brings us to two very important issues. The question of representation. I want to argue that representation and participation have been the Achilles heel of public broadcasting. Representation in English carries two different senses, both of which are very important. On the one hand, we talk of representations, meaning the way we talk and picture things in different cultural forms and genres. But representation is also... But they couldn't ignore the United States completely. The United States, at that point in time, was becoming the world's dominant cultural power. It wasn't before World War I, but it was afterwards. It took advantage of not having been damaged by the war. This was when you see the rise of Hollywood as a great world filmic power, and the massive worldwide seduction of jazz and American popular music. So public broadcasting, because it had public money and because it had to offer something for everybody, had to confront popular enthusiasm, particularly for American popular music. But it did so in a grudging way. Christopher Stone, who was one of the BBC's early experts on dance music, writes in his autobiography that he felt obliged to include at least one American effort, as he put it, in his weekly show. But he was careful, and I quote, to introduce a faint scoff in my voice when I introduce it. So he actually had it written into the way he spoke. He said, oh, I hear something from those darkies over there. I think he's called Ellington. He calls himself a duke, but he's not really a duke. And that sort of thing. So, yes, it was there, but they didn't really want it to be there. And this nation-building project was also contradictory. It opened up a wonderful space for national production, in which amazing things took place. Because broadcasting, because of its novelty, became a great magnet for the avant-garde. Some of the greatest avant-garde writers and artists of the time flocked to radio to see what that new medium could do, producing things like Dylan Thomas's great Under Milk Wood, one of the great pieces of radio ever produced. But it had two other negative consequences. It was a fabricated unity. It was a unity which would not come to terms with the deep differences in the social fabric. It simply would not acknowledge them. And it offered a very thin, what I call thin cosmopolitanism. It was either the image of the empire or it was the image of democracy against communism. The map of the world was very, very restricted. And so, not surprisingly, the history of public broadcasting after the Second War and the arrival of television centred very much upon struggles for representation, struggles to prize that open. And as you move through into the 1960s, you see a whole series of waves of people beating on the door, saying, we're not going to put up with this anymore. We want to be there. We want to say what we've got to say. Women, young people, gays, and particularly in Britain and in many other countries, the great long coming to terms with the aftermath of colonialism, both external and internal. Post-colonial broadcasting is still a massively problematic project. That the loss of empire was an enormous trauma. But gradually you see public broadcasters beginning to respond to that. They begin to devise new kinds of programs that will accommodate these voices and give them a space. In the most radical version, they actually hand the cameras over to people to make their own films, their own programs, over which they have editorial control. But there are other things. You begin to see the introduction of talk shows which are debating these issues in a much more open way. You have a new style of documentary based on the free cinema nouvelle vague idea that you try to get as close to everyday life as possible. You don't have a voiceover commentary. You simply have raw slices of life. And at a structural level, you see new channels developing. SBS in Australia, for example, which originally is to accommodate migrant communities and later becomes a much more ambitious project to accommodate those voices which are excluded from the mainstream. Similar project in Britain with Channel 4, which its charter expressly begins with the injunction that it must cater for those voices that do not have sufficient representation in other places. The problem is that it's exactly at that moment when public broadcasters are beginning to understand and beginning to respond to this crisis of representation and beginning to overcome the negative parts of this dichotomy when you get the great wave of marketisation sweep over the broadcasting industry. That you move from a situation where public broadcasters have a very central and reasonably secure role, increasingly to a very precarious and embattled position, as you have waves and waves of commercial intervention. New cable stations, new satellite stations, new terrestrial commercial stations. Europe's a very good example. In 1980, only 2 countries in Europe had dual systems, where you had public service and commercial stations competing. One was the United Kingdom, and the other was Italy, where Silvio Berlusconi had finessed the rules to bring commercial television in through the back door. All the others, apart from Luxembourg, that always had a commercial monopoly, but it's tiny. I mean, it's about the size of downtown. I mean, you can walk across Luxembourg in 5 minutes. It's not exactly a big player, although it has been a big player in terms of hosting commercial broadcasting that was beamed to other parts of Europe. Every other major European country had a public monopoly. This is in 1980. By 1997, only 3 public monopolies were left: Austria, Ireland and Switzerland, and all of them were actively negotiating to introduce commercial television. So in the space of 2 decades, you go from a situation where public broadcasting was the only game in town to a situation where the dominant force is a commercial force. This goes along with this battering down of the market barriers, goes along with a massive shifting of the regulatory system away from a defence of the public interest and towards the promotion of competition. If you can secure consumer rights of choice in the marketplace, you will have done all that is necessary to guarantee democracy and freedom. We can begin to see why that is problematic if you actually look at the programming consequences of this great market push. Superficially, it looks wonderful. There are more ordinary people on television than at any time in the history of broadcasting. Television is awash with non-expert opinion. It's awash with ordinary lives. It seems to have solved overnight the problem of representation and participation. Everybody's on television all the time, and they're speaking in their own voice. But consider the formats in which this happens. Talk shows across Europe have moved from being forums for the discussion of public issues to really being public counselling and therapy sessions for the cure of people's personal agonies and disablements. But the Jerry Springer, we don't have fights, or they do actually in the Netherlands now. But the idea is not to debate public issues. The idea is to investigate in a very voyeuristic way the intimate details of the breakdown of family life. So you see a kind of a massive individualisation of the talk show format. You see the rise of something called reality television, which is one of the great marketing cons of all time. It should be banned, reality television, the term reality television. But what is reality television? The 2 most successful formats in the history of television have been Big Brother and Pop Idol. And what do these formats do? They're a very clever hybrid of the fly-on-the-wall documentary and the game show. So you have people imprisoned in a house, to which they've consented, who are filmed 24 hours a day, except on the toilet. Even European countries don't film them on the toilet, although they will soon, I'm sure. And they're competing for a prize. And this is closer, supposedly, to everyday life. But it's interesting. What is it that they're competing for? It's not only the prize, they're competing to become celebrities. In Pop Idol, of course, they're competing to become a pop star. But all of the Big Brother contestants become celebrities. They get to open supermarkets, they get to go to the first nights of movies. People know who they are. And what is a celebrity? A celebrity is an investment advisor in the supermarket of styles. That's what celebrities are for. They tell us how to dress, how our front room should be kitted out. We have celebrity magazines. There's a wonderful magazine which is called Hello magazine, which features people you've never heard of. They're minor mates of Prince Charles, and they're people who've been on game shows like Big Brother. And they have features of their homes. They invite you into their home. This is what I've done with all the money, isn't it wonderful? Nothing at all to do with citizenship. It's to do with consolidating a very individualistic, consumerist view of the world. But this is all of this massive shift, this hijacking, if you like, of the rights of participation and of deliberation and of representation, is taking place against the background of something else, a massive, unstoppable shift in the technology of broadcasting, away from analogue to digital. Now, this is unstoppable because governments around the world are determined to do it, because they want to release the spectrum space currently occupied by the very bulky broadcasting signals and sell it off for other purposes, mainly telecommunications and data transmission. They see enormous sums of money being bid in auction for this spare spectrum space. This transition towards a fully digital broadcasting environment has the capacity to change utterly public broadcasting's future in two ways. First of all, it allows more channels to come on stream, and public broadcasters have been experimenting with that potential. The BBC has a whole series of new channels which have just been judged by an official report to be successful. The most successful is the channel for preschool children, CBeebies. When that was first proposed, the commercial lobby argued there was no point in having it because they already had lots of children's channels. So they do. The argument was that children and their parents have a right to watch television without being interrupted by advertising. And that CBeebies, if it did nothing else, if it offered a service without advertising, would be significantly different to all of the commercial channels. This is now seen to be a very successful adventure. So public broadcasters have the chance to have new channels which will allow them to serve audiences which have been squeezed out of the main channels. They're also experimenting with the interactive capacity of digital television. So that in the last few months, for example, to give you some European examples, people have been able to select which Olympic events they watch. They don't have to watch the one that's being broadcast. They can choose from a menu. They can register how they want the plot of a radio play to develop. The play is interrupted at different points and they're given options as to how they want it to move on. They can, on the BBC News, pull down a menu which gives them lots more background material on the stories that are currently running on the screen. And they can take part in games and other activities related to programmes they've just seen, entertainment and drama programmes, after the transmission's finished. Interactivity has been trumpeted as a great victory for consumer power. But we have to be very careful about that. The fundamental relationship between broadcasters and audiences in all of those situations is exactly the same. It is still a top-down system. Viewers are still operating within a set of menus that have been determined by program makers. These menus are now increasingly flexible but you're still not allowed into the kitchen. You can't cook in the kitchen. You can have 100 dishes, but you can't cook. I want to argue that the real possibility for changing public broadcasting lies with the internet. And I want to say very clearly that since so much of what's been written on the internet, which is not rankly pessimistic, is wildly optimistic, utopian, that we have to be very aware of the problems. The internet is not, in its present form, a cure. In fact, it may be more of a problem than a cure. There are three really important problems with the internet at the moment. First of all, access is still everywhere highly stratified. It's highly stratified by income, stratified by age, and it's stratified by educational level. So you have substantial numbers of poorer households, elderly people, early leavers from education, who face the prospect of being permanently excluded. Even if they manage to get basic connectivity, the system is going to run away from them. The next generation of high-speed, always-on broadband, which will be capable of taking whole movies, for example, will be too expensive, massively too expensive for the kind of families I'm working with at the moment. So they will be left with the poor person's internet, a thin, not chunky, not very flexible medium. So it's not that they may not ever have access, but they will never have state-of-the-art access if it's left in this situation. Secondly, the internet hollows out the public domain. It's an interesting mirror image of the explosion of niche cable and satellite channels and the arrival of personal video recorders in television. What you see is the individualization of experience, the increasing specialization of what's offered. The consequence of that is that even now, and we're still at the very primitive, we're at the very outer rim of this transformation. It's going to open up in ways that we're only just beginning to imagine. But even now it's clear that it's possible only to watch what you already know you want to watch and enjoy, and to only encounter the opinions of people you know you will already agree with. You can absent yourself from deliberation. You can absent yourself from challenge. You can immerse yourself in a warm bath of comforting familiarity. This is problematic because we now face a situation, as you saw in the US election, but you see in even more dramatic cases in other countries, where worldviews are more polarised than they have been for a very long time. And they're more violently defended than they have been for a long time. In this situation of massive polarisation, having a space in which people can talk across divisions and across differences on the basis of knowledge and respect, to have a truly deliberative space, is more important than it's ever been before. And in fact, if that space is allowed to go, we will not have a democratic culture in the true sense of the word. We will have a facsimile of democracy, which is exactly what Jürgen Habermas predicts. He calls it re-feudalisation. He says, we'll go back to the Middle Ages, where you have great dynastic empires of commerce and of politics who will simply impose their will. Pretty close to that now in a lot of countries. So the stakes are enormous. This is the moment when democracy will either be something that we can write about nostalgically, or it will become a living part of people's lives. But there's one other massively important problem with the internet as it's currently configured, and that is, like every other cultural domain, it's become an arena of corporate activity and expansion. And it's a paradox that the increasing individualisation of consumption and the trumpeting of consumer choice has been accompanied by an unprecedented consolidation of media ownership and the rise of corporations of unprecedented reach across the entire domain, not just of the media, but of leisure, of sports. These control everything outside of working time. And so the individualisation of consumption leaves people much more vulnerable than they've ever been to the blandishments of those kinds of seductions. And consumerism is massively seductive. Okay, that's the bad news. The good news is that I think there are two very powerful counter-tendencies to this process of commodification, fragmentation, and exclusion. One is based on a revivified philosophy of public goods, and the other in a new moral economy of gifts. Now, I'm just going to do 2 seconds of economics for you. Off-air broadcasting has always been what economists call a public good. A public good has 2 characteristics. One is you can't exclude anybody from using it, and B, when they do use it, they don't interfere with anybody else's enjoyment. And it's usually contrasted with a commodity. A commodity would be something like a cinema ticket. When the cinema's full, no one else can come in, and unless we have quickly developed a very much more intimate relationship that is usually possible in these situations, we can't both sit in the same seat. So, lots of cultural goods are commodities. But public broadcasting has always been a public good in the sense that it was universal, non-exclusive, and it didn't interfere with other people. So it was a massive mechanism for inclusion, which was why it was so attractive both to governments, but also, of course, to corporations. But it's also, public broadcasting has also been a public good in the more philosophical sense. It's always been seen as an activity that aimed to contribute to the quality of communal life and to the development of democratic culture. Now, other public institutions also shared this ideal, but what public broadcasting did was to become a gathering up place for initiatives that had been fragmented in many other institutions, adult educational institutions, libraries, museums, galleries, publicly sponsored concerts. A long tradition of public subsidy of cultural activity outside the market. But these institutions had a crippling disability, which was space and location. They could not be universal in the way that broadcasting was. You had to go to the gallery to see the painting. And if you were unfortunate enough to go on a day when everybody else turned up, you couldn't actually see the painting because there'd be 15 people standing in front of it. So they had the problem of space and location. The internet actually, for the first time, allows all public institutions to universalise their activities. And so you see now a massive amount of activity. Libraries, archives, museums, galleries are all going online and trying to make the whole of their holdings available to everybody without discrimination. A good example would be the Tate Gallery, Tate Britain in London. When the great British artist Turner died, he left all of his work to the nation. But because he was fiercely productive, didn't seem to go to sleep, enormous amount of stuff. And the Tate Gallery has a new wing on it, which was specifically to house some Turners, but they could only get a few of them in there. So nobody has ever been able to see all the Turners. They've always been in the basement. They bring a couple of them up occasionally. Thousands and thousands of them. They're now all on the net. So if you're at all interested in art, you can actually watch have a look at everything the man ever did. You can watch it chronologically, you can compare it thematically, you can compare it by his change in style, you can play with it. This is fantastic. If you go to the Smithsonian Institute site, you'll see they've had some of the very first movies made in the world, made by Edison. You can download them for nothing. So all of these public institutions are now beginning to come online. So we have an enormous repository of publicly available material of all kinds. One of the institutions that is problematic is, I have to say, universities. Because traditionally lectures and publications have been considered intellectual property. Either the intellectual property of the individual scholar, or increasingly, in some British universities, they're trying to force new staff to sign a contract that says that all of the intellectual property they produce belongs to the university, which they will sell. One university, which will be nameless, tried to enforce a contract where all the lecture notes, if a member of staff left, they would have to leave every piece of paper they'd ever written on in their office. They couldn't take them to their new institution in case the university could sell them for distance learning. So that scholarship becomes another commodity to be traded, and it can be very valuable. But there's a counter-movement to this. The idea of the Creative Commons, which is promoting a new kind of copyright. The Creative Commons license says that you have the right to use my work freely, providing you don't use it for commercial purposes. And many scholars and artists are now signing such rights. One of the great victories, the faculty of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology have agreed, and this includes Noam Chomsky, have agreed to put all of their lectures on the web for free, on the grounds that the public already own them. Because it's a public institution, you as the public have a right to my knowledge. You've already paid for it. I'm being paid from taxation. You shouldn't have to pay again. This is a very important principle, and it's going to open up all sorts of material, including the BBC's archives. The BBC has a plan which they call the Creative Archive, where they're going to, in the same spirit, put all of their past programmes on the web for anyone to use for nothing, providing they don't reuse them for commercial purposes. So we're looking at a profound intervention which will reconfigure both the availability of publicly funded material around the world and also allow it to be used actively in all sorts of ways. But there's also another counter-principle to the commodity, the philosophy of gifts. A good example would be Wikipedia. Wikipedia is the largest encyclopedia in world history. It's been compiled entirely from voluntary contributions, and it's based on a philosophy of reciprocity. I post an entry because I know something about X. I don't ask you to pay me anything, but we do enter into a social contract. I expect that if you know something that might interest me, you in turn will post it and make it available to me. So we have a non-money, non-commodity system that's capable of producing an amazingly complex repository of human knowledge. Also, a repository that's open to correction and dispute. All the Wikipedia entries are continually being revised by other people. So it's a collaborative system. And so we have three economies on the internet. You have the economy of commodities, paid for by prices. Once you've paid, you own what you paid for, but you're a consumer. You can take it or leave it. We have an economy of public goods, paid for out of taxation, based on the principle of free public access, and as you enter that, you're a citizen in the traditional sense. But we have also a third economy, an economy of gifts, based on reciprocity, it's collective production, and you are part of the process of production. You're not a recipient, you're an active participant in creating this repository for other people. Now, broadcasters have also gone online. But if you look at most of the commercial broadcasting sites, they're there basically to cement loyalty among their audiences. But they have the potential, and this is the potential that some of the public broadcasters are beginning to understand, to do something much more ambitious than that. They have the potential to be the key node in a network that would join together the products of this philosophy of public goods and the gift economy. Now, why do I nominate public broadcasting as this privileged point of entry? Well, I think it has three advantages over every other institution. First of all, it's familiar. It's already in everybody's house. People enjoy it. They know what television is. Integrating internet capacity into the TV set would not be a great shock to people. They're already used to using the television for other things. Teletext, for example, is very widely used everywhere that it's available. And it's used in much the same way that people use the internet. People check and use headlines, they check the weather, they look for travel bargains, and so on. So teletext, which has been around for almost a quarter of a century, is already an ancillary project. People are very used to using video recorders of all kinds as a logical part of the television. So the idea that what is on the screen is the only thing that television does hasn't been true for a very long time. So I think television is as a medium, is very well placed to integrate the internet into its next generation of digital sets. This will not be easy because there's a great push the other way. Bill Gates and the computer industry want to bring television into the computer. They want computers to be the place where people would watch movies, watch downloaded programs and so on. And you shouldn't underestimate how ambitious they are to do that. So there's going to be a big struggle over the machine, whether it's a computer-enhanced television or a television-enhanced computer. That's the first struggle. Television, and particularly public broadcasting, has two other massive advantages. First of all, it is highly trusted. Despite all the grumpiness that people have about public broadcasting, when it comes down to the wire, it's the same with universities. People trust them. They trust them not to sell them anything, and they trust them to behave by and large in the public interest. If you ask people about trust, why do you trust some things and not others? Those are the two criteria. I don't want to be sold something. I don't want somebody just to be doing it for their own private gain. So the idea of public interest, the idea that there should be some things which are simply there because they have a public value, is actually deeply ingrained in the way people look at the world. And public broadcasters have very high levels of public trust, precisely because they don't try to sell things. And that means that they're potentially able to be, I would say, the portal of choice for people. The challenge is for public broadcasters to play this role in what I call the digital commons. I call it the digital commons because the history of the commons was a history of the struggle against the enclosure of communal space. We see the same process now, not in terms of land, but in terms of the space of the imagination. It's being enclosed by two things. It's being enclosed by commerce, but it's being enclosed by fundamentalist movements of all kinds that are forcing people to make choices between one side or another, breaking apart any concept of deliberation. That the digital commons would be the space that opposes both of those tendencies. And because of the high levels of trust, broadcasting has the potential to do that in a way that no other institution has. Familiarity plus trust allows broadcasters to become a presence on the net, not just for themselves, but as a gateway to all these other resources. And they have one other massive advantage. They have the potential to counter the individualisation and fragmentation of experience. This used to be done in broadcasting, the philosophy of mixed programming, where you'd have all sorts of different programmes, one after the other. And the idea of that was that people who tuned in or wanted to watch something they already liked would stay on for the programme next. And they might be surprised by the fact that they didn't expect to be interested, but they found something that they really engaged their attention. You crept up on them by stealth. Mixed programming is really gone as a strategy. The competitive strategy is about channel branding and promoting the channel identity, and that's cut across. But web surfing allows exactly the same process. When you go into a website, like the BBC's website, you might go in because you're a fan of EastEnders, for example, but you see an enormous array of other things, and you might think, oh, actually, I might have a look at that. So web surfing actually allows people, or the way people behave now, pulls them in directions simply out of curiosity. So that's a plus. But even if they go in because their interest has been triggered by a particular programme they've watched, that still provides some basis in shared experience. And the BBC has been recently very good at orchestrating kind of shared experience of that kind, and has been very successful in getting people involved in all sorts of projects. So we're looking at a situation where broadcasters have to think of themselves as no longer a standalone institution, but as a privileged node in a network, so that the responsibility of public broadcasting in the future will not simply be to continue to make programmes, but it will be to organise this digital commons, to make it possible for people to make the best of all the material that's out there, and to be helped to navigate their way through it. Now, as I say, there are huge barriers to that, which we shouldn't underestimate. Not only the commercial push from the other side, but the substantial costs. This is not going to be a cheap option. Certainly not going to be a cheap option for broadcasters. It's going to require more public money. And it won't initially be a cheap option for viewers and listeners. They will have to buy new digital sets. But they're going to have to do that anyway, because the analog signals will be switched off. So this is the moment where we can begin to envisage a much broader view of television, not just as a load more channels, but as something much more ambitious, and something that would finally overcome the contradictions that have devilled broadcasting, partly because of its technological limitations, but also because of its social and political fix. So I see this as a really decisive moment. If we lose this battle, I think we face a very bleak future. I think public broadcasting will become more marginal, and I think it will deserve to be more marginal. If it does not take this opportunity, I also think we will not have, in any real sense of the term, a democratic society, and I think citizenship will become so thin as to be almost transparent. If you want to live in a society that is dominated by the landscape of consumerism, and this is a landscape that has now spread across the entire world, then do nothing. But if you don't want that, and I certainly don't want that, then this is the moment. We have a window of opportunity, as they say, but it will close. It will be kicked shut and it will be nailed shut if we don't keep it open. So I come to you with a utopian proposition. But I'd finish with a quotation from Bertolt Brecht. If you consider that utopian, I would ask you to consider why. Thank you.